Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Leaning. I am the Senior Research Associate at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. And I've done many other things in the past, but it will take too long to talk about it, except I want you to realize that this book was prompted because much of my avocational work and then my scholarly work has been involved in observing, participating, and investigating issues of violations of human rights, medical care, the notion of autonomy, and the ways in which populations caught up in war and conflict are crushed, just crushed by those events. So that's what I've been studying and thinking about and teaching about for a very long time. This is I don't know, this is not an historian's decade. This is worse, okay? In 2000, I came out of a seminar at the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies and talked to the then acting director because there had been mention of the partition of India. And with some of the issues that are attached to that. And I came out and I said to him, a very renowned economist from Oxford, I said, Sudhir, how many people actually were killed or died during the partition of British India, 1947? And he's very, deep, knowledgeable economist, which means he knows a lot of history, and trained in the British tradition, so he does. And he said, let me check. And he came back to me a couple of days and said, I don't think anybody really knows. So this is 2000. And I said, well, that's unbelievable. Let's figure this out. So I got a number of colleagues of mine, and they got some colleagues, biostatisticians, demographers, people who know about documents. None of them really knew about the partition of British India. But the demographer I enlisted, a very fine professor called Ken Hill, he said, well, let's start to see what the census documents show. And lo and behold, and they're here in Widener, there are from the late 1880s all the way up through the present, and I hope beyond, are every 10 years the censuses of what was British India back in the 1880s, and after partition, marvelously, because things were extraordinarily bitter after the partition of British India in 1947, the two chief officers for the Commission of the Census in both Pakistan and India met and agreed they would keep the same dates, the same protocols, and that they would add, this is it, in the 1951 census of British India, where were you, all you hundreds of millions? That still at that time they were counting by individuals. Where were you in 1947? That was the only question that was added. And Ken and colleagues basically did sort of artificial estimates and re-estimates based on sequential study of the census. How many people were missing from 1947 to 1951? And what they actually came up with was something that is that's pretty extraordinary. 15 to 18 million people crossed the Punjab border alone, one way or the other, because we decided to focus on the Punjab. Partition in the eastern part of India is much more complicated and long-lasting, not in terms of memory, but in terms of process. 15 to 18 million people in those years crossed the border, one way or the other, from what is now Pakistani Punjab into Indian Punjab and back the other way. And approximately 2 to 3 million people died, meaning they were missing from the 1951 census. So we did extensive analysis, in and out migration, Indian deaths during the World War II, et cetera, and these numbers held strong. So then, for my background as a humanitarian analyst, I said, that is still, and it still is, it was there in 2000 or 2008 when our paper in Pop Studies came out, it's still the largest instance of forced migration in a humanitarian crisis ever seen in the world. And those numbers Those numbers who died when we established that there was no other place they could have bled out of the partition, bled out of the subcontinent, those numbers who died were actually far too great from just looking at who dies in forced migration than you see in the forced migrations then 2000, 2008, 2015, even now, 2023. There was something edgy about that number who died. So then I began to explore what actually happened in 1947, partition. And I realized I needed to get a team of people together, which would include some demographers, but also a number of people from the subcontinent, because I do not come from the subcontinent. And to begin to burrow into their libraries and their consciousness and their sense of history, I would need to have people who are historians or artists or storytellers or demographers from the subcontinent. So the Weatherhead Center basically gave me a very good lead in terms of support to do that. And then after years of work, because it wasn't that this was the first full-time occupation, and then I beseeched the Mittal Institute, the South Asia Institute, then the Mittal Institute, to help me further. So with funding that was relatively robust, I was able to bring together scholars from India, some scholars from the United States, and come up with this book, The 1947 Partition of British India, subtitled Forced Migration and Its Reverberations. So let me give you a couple of insights, okay? If you think about the partition of India, it's been studied a lot by historians, demographers, sociologists, et cetera. But the general narrative is at the high level of state politics. Nehru and Jinnah and the Brits. There are some, particularly in more current times, deeper studies, ethnographic studies, what happened to women. There are some marvelous studies coming out now about partition. But none have focused on this humanitarian question. Who died? How? Where? And what happened? And so this involved looking at the various newspapers in India and Pakistan that were focusing on the Punjab. There's some very good ones. It involved all sorts of archives in India and in the British Library. And what we came out with was a story of privation, fear, long-lived loss, and the point that these people were not just forced across a border between Lahore and Amritsar. They fled and they died. And the killing happened not just in those choke points, but it happened in the countryside. Very, very large number of micro massacres. And so part of what the survivors of partition have to deal with, and their descendants, is this deep animus and sense of grievance that was not just a political decision that was made by the superpowers, but was what was carried out by the other side, okay, the religious other side, that is now still something under great investigation. Thank you.